Mr. Gurr, we now turn to the pre-appointment hearings for the role to which you've applied to be chair of the Competition Market Authority. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. What I thought I would do is just actually set out the 6 or 7 basic concerns that we want to get into over the course of our time together this afternoon. And colleagues around the table have got lots of questions, but I just thought it'd be helpful if I frame some of the issues that we've got at the top of the meeting so that you can orientate yourself. So the first issue is that over the last 10 years we've got a CMA that has basically doubled in size from about 650 staff to over 1,200 staff. Yet when we look at the competitive dynamics of the UK economy, they have not got stronger, they have deteriorated. So that is problem number one. Second, we're obviously very concerned about whether and how robustly you will stand up to ministers, given that your predecessor was effectively removed. We're especially concerned about whether you will seek to prioritise investment, even if it delivers market consolidation rather than improving consumer welfare. And we note that over the last year the CMA has vetoed 0 mergers, which is the first time that's happened since 2017. The third issue we've obviously got is the prioritisation of our constituents' interests. So our constituents are mired in a cost of living crisis, and yet our perspective is that hitherto the CMA has proved quite slow to launch market investigations, and I think our view is that enforcement action hitherto has been quite weak. The fourth issue is then around the risk of conflicts of interest. So you have obviously spent much of your career working with one of the world's largest oligopolies, Amazon. It was investigated by the CMA for the risk of fake reviews in May 2020, while you were still the Amazon UK country director. And fake reviews are not a marginal problem. They are an economic harm that costs the country up to £300 million. But there is a critical decision ahead about whether Amazon is designated with strategic market status, and so we're concerned about whether you might pull your punches and leave the new powers available to the CMA unused. The fifth issue is then around time management. So you are obviously running one of the world's most important visitor attractions for much of the week, and so we are really looking for quite a lot of reassurance that it's possible to do all of the things that you're doing. We have then got a set of concerns around the use of the new powers that are available to the CMA. So we note with some concern that there has been a delay in seeking remedies from Google around its relationship with news producers. I think that's been delayed for another 12 months. And when it comes to Google and Apple mobile ecosystems, the CMA has sought non-binding, frankly legally meaningless commitments, not legally binding market conduct requirements. And then finally, we're obviously concerned about the CMA as an organisation simply because a budgeting error has now required a 10% staff reduction. I'm conscious that happened before your tenure, but the staff surveys that are available to us show that only around a quarter of people want to stay working for the CMA for the next 3 years. So you can see there's sort of quite a long list of things that we want to go over this afternoon, but I just thought it would be quite helpful to set that out to help orientate this hearing. So let me just start off with your theory of growth. So we're all pro-growth. You've been appointed because ministers are convinced that you're going to take a pro-growth perspective and bring that to bear at the CMA. Just give us a sense of what you think is holding back growth in the British economy.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed, Committee, for the opportunity to appear here. Really appreciate that chance, and thank you, Chair, for setting out so clearly. That's incredibly helpful. So coming back specifically to the issue of growth, and perhaps if I may just start with why growth matters. I mean, I think
you don't need to rehearse that too much. We're all pretty keen on growth on this side of the table too.
Great. Well, we're good. Well, I'll go straight into that. Look, there are a number of things that contribute to growth. We know that. It's access to skills. It's typically access to markets. But one of the most important things that contributes to growth is business investment. Business investment is what actually improves productivity. It drives innovation. It's one of those most important things. And actually, when you asked about what's holding back the UK, one of the challenges we've had for a long time is that business investment has been very low. I think we've been bottom of the G7 for each of the last 15 years. And that's quite a difficult challenge. Now, we can debate the reasons for that, but a lot of it comes back to businesses. And by businesses, that includes both domestic businesses, it includes global multinationals who have operations here, and very free choices about where to choose to invest. And it also includes, if you like, global capital money. Where does it choose to go? It has options. And as I say, there are a number of things that drive business decisions about where to invest. You want to feel that you're operating somewhere where you know there are market opportunities. You want to feel the talent is here. But one of the single most important things, and I say this having sat around the table over many years having these kind of discussions, is do we have confidence in a stable, predictable regulatory environment? Because very often the investments you're making might have 10 or 20 or 30-year time horizons. And they're incredibly sensitive to, if you like, what are the rules of the game. And so one of the things that very rapidly scares off investment and hence slows down growth is if you're just not clear what the rules are and what the investment is. So again, when I first had the conversations around 12 months ago about, when I was first asked to take on this role on an interim basis, that was very much the focus. How do we actually encourage businesses to have the confidence to invest in the UK, but crucially do it without, and I'm very pleased you touched on some of these issues, without in any sense walking away from our commitment to strong competition. We know how important that is, and crucially without walking away from our commitment to consumer protection. Now I know there's lots of debate about can you really square that circle, but again, for me that's very clear things. If you want to support growth, one of the most important things, not the only thing, but one of the most important things an organisation like the CMA can contribute to is that stable, predictable regulatory environment that gives businesses of all sizes and all jurisdictions the confidence to invest here, subject to absolute belief in competition and absolute belief in consumer protection.
Okay, that's very helpful. So when we look back over the last 10 years of market consolidation in the UK, your evidence from the CMA but also the ONS confirm this too. Business dynamism is diminishing in the UK when you look at entry and exit rates, but also when you look at the increase in markups, for example. So do you think that is a problem?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that actually that's a global phenomenon. So if you look across all markets in the world, you'll see a general tendency of a reduction in that. And you'll also see, there's a sort of slightly positive case, which is the slowdown is less in the UK than it is elsewhere. But actually, I do think it's a challenge because what it's really telling you is there isn't sufficient evidence of market entries, there isn't sufficient evidence of innovation, and all of those things. And if you end up in a situation where, if you like, there's too much incumbency and not enough innovation, again, you will see that slowdown in competition, and that in turn applies to, as you say, has the consequences, you say, of consumer harm, detriment. And I think the challenge for us, therefore, is what can we do to encourage that growth and competition? What can we do to encourage innovation? And actually, if I may, interesting, having spent quite a lot of time over the last 12 months talking to business and talking about the opportunities, this is one of the areas, so one of the things that comes out loud and clear is actually the question of public procurement. And actually, the UK central government alone spent £385 billion on public procurement last year. That's just central government, never mind local authorities and other distributed organisations. And I think part of the challenge, and we hear this loud and clear from businesses, is that for really good and understandable reasons, the public procurement processes have become very complex. And we understand that. Of course, you've got to mitigate against all sorts of risks. But the unintended consequence of that complexity is that actually you've made it really hard for businesses to get in, and particularly hard for startups, innovative businesses to get access. And actually, if I put a competition lens on, that actually reduces competition. So imagine if you're now a public procurer, whether that's in the health space or the defence space or in the transport space, if actually you reduce the pool of competition, and in particular if you make it hard for innovative scaling businesses to get access, that's one of the things that I think has the biggest impact. And again, if I may, it's been quite sobering, I think, actually in some ways, to listen to British businesses, saying to us, we're an innovative British business, we've got through the startup stage, we're trying to scale, and we sell to many countries around the world. We don't sell in the UK.
What are the lessons of that analysis then for what the CMA has to do in the future? So if we've got this, doubling of the CMA size over the last 10 years, we've admitted that competitive environment has deteriorated, not improved. You flagged this interesting point about the role of public procurement, but what does the CMA have to do differently if it is to both encourage an increase in business investment in the future, but also, frankly, a healthier, more fierce competitive environment?
No, thank you. I mean, a brilliant question that goes to the heart of it. So if I can refer you, if I may, to the strategy we published a few months ago, and in particular the current draft annual plan, which is out for consultation. What you'll see is we're saying, look, we have two things we do. We work on competition and we work on consumer protection. We do it for the reasons we understand, to drive growth, and also crucially to improve household prosperity. That's the goal of the outcome. And if you look at the 5 strategic priorities we've laid out, there's a piece which is just around using the toolkit for competition. But one of the most important things is there are things we do directly. There's obviously our mergers work, there's our subsidy advice. But one of the most important things I think we've highlighted is to say, actually, I think there's an important role for the CMA at looking precisely at these questions you've raised. What are the barriers? What is it that stops startups scaling in the UK? We do pretty well on startups, we struggle on scale-ups. And that brings me back to these questions around, we think there's as I say, there is a challenge, and we are already doing work and will continue to do work around public procurement. We'll continue to look at these areas where you're saying, what are the cross-economy barriers that are slowing it down? Public procurement, yes. The other one we flagged very clear as one of those priorities is that point I came back to, that how do we create the environment that will encourage business investment? And in some ways, how do we reassure not just domestic businesses that they can invest with confidence because they know there's a stable, predictable regulatory regime, but also how do we encourage both international businesses who have a very wide choice about where to invest, that the UK is really where you want to be.
So if you get a significant investor who comes along, proposes investment which will up the level of business investment in the UK economy, but nevertheless exacerbate market consolidation and potentially diminish consumer welfare, are you not caught between the strategic steer from the Chancellor, which is thou shalt increase investment, and actually the things that we're interested in, which is a more competitive business environment that drives down costs for our constituents?
No. I mean, a great point. And again, these are. If I come back to that point, it's our sort of mission. Our tools are not. Growth is an outcome of the work we do on encouraging competition and improving consumer household prosperity. So in some ways, if somebody came along, and in many cases that investment we're trying to encourage is not about something that would cause a detriment, it's saying how do we actually build a new facility here? How do we actually persuade large organisations that when you're thinking about establishing a new R&D facility, which will increase competition, because we want more people to enter the market, we want more people coming in, we absolutely know that competition is one of the most powerful ways of driving benefit. How do we actually encourage them to place those facilities here in the UK? And again, I come back to that point that very often when organisations, that includes both large, as I say, multinational organisations, but also crucially global venture money, when they're looking at opportunities, they say, what is the business environment like? What is the regulatory environment like? Can we agree on the predictability? That kind of investment will increase competition. And we believe passionately that increasing competition will, over time, increase consumer benefit. And
you think the circle can be squared?
Absolutely. I mean, one has to be very cautious about talking in absolute generalities here. The reality is everything has to be examined case by case. But if it was, for example, a case of an organisation that was coming in saying, look, we're willing to make an investment in this country that will actually expand the number of competitors in an area, that would be a perfect example, because you're getting both business investment, you're hopefully introducing a new competitor or expanding the competitor in a way that's actually going to increase the productivity of that organisation.
What if it's diminishing the competitive pressure in the environment?
So
what if it is, buying up hundreds of small firms to kill in the crib, threats to future innovation, and you're actually not necessarily triggering merger thresholds, but you are definitely consolidating new industries in a way that diminishes consumer welfare?
No, I'm a really good and important question. That's why I come back to that sort of original framing, if you like, which is how do you encourage the maximum possible level of business investment subject to the absolute constraints of not reducing competition and not causing consumer harm. So it's, if you like, it's, and forgive me, for my sins, I started my career as a mathematician. It's what we call a constrained optimization problem. So it's not investment at all costs. It's investment subject to those two absolute constraints. Investment such that you're not going to diminish competition and you're not going to cause consumer detriment.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Mr. Gurr, using that analogy you made of the constrained optimization problem, is the CMA already at the optimal frontier? And if not, where could it be improved?
I think there's an enormous amount the CMA can do, and in the 12 or so months that I've spent there, I have been genuinely struck by the opportunities. And again, if you'll permit me for a moment, genuinely struck by the opportunities to actually improve the lives of UK citizens. I think there's work we can do directly around consumer protection, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the harms we see and how we can address those. But also genuinely, if we can encourage both that business investment, that scale up, that dynamicism, if we can drive the growth, we know that growth is what will help to fund the essential public services, and it will help to put money back in consumers' pockets. And by the way, that's part of the virtual circle, because you asked, and the Chair very rightly started with the question of what drives growth. One of those other things that drives growth is we know if consumers have confidence and they have prosperity, then they can start to invest.
You mentioned the 15 years of low private investment in the UK, which has really damaged our economy. Do you think the CMA had any part to play in that?
I don't think I'm the best person to comment on the past 15 years and so on. I think I would focus, and there are many factors we can all look back to over those past 15 years which clearly had an impact. What I do know is that going forward, I do think the CMA can have a big role to play in turning that around. And again, it comes back to that point of and genuinely, I think this is a really good time, for good and understandable reasons. And in my experiences, businesses find uncertainty quite challenging. And again, the reason they find it quite challenging is if you just look at the time frames, very often these investments have a 10, 15, 20, 30-year payback. And one thing that is that you therefore want to be able to model roughly what are the rules of the game being. And as soon as you introduce a high level of uncertainty, the inevitable consequence is people just say, we'll just wait and see. So in a sense, we've had a period of latent wait and see. I actually therefore think that simply giving that stability, that confidence, that predictability actually is going to, again, I don't want to be too optimistic about this, but I genuinely believe from conversations I have there is pent-up demand, there is an opportunity, and if we can get behind that opportunity, I think that will really benefit not just UK businesses.
You're giving us a pretty clear prioritisation of the way that decisions are taken. So you're saying, I think, pretty clearly that driving up investment is secondary to improving the competitive environment and improving customer welfare.
So if I may, I again, I hate to reuse what sounds like a very jargonistic phrase, but it's not that those things come as secondary. It's just that you have to say the maximum possible business investment subject to not harming the competitive environment and not harming consumers. Now, that means when you look case by case, there will be potential investments where we say, you know what, that's great. It's going to improve productivity. It's going to bring new competitors. It's going to actually improve services to customers. That feels really good. There may be, and again, without getting too much into hypotheticals, there may be situations where you say, you know what, this investment causes challenges, and that's where we have obviously the tools to look at all of these things.
Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to follow back on the comment you made about investment having been low for a long time. I was Director of Strategy at Innovate Finance, the fintech trade body, and I'm sure you'll be aware that in fintech we are third only to China and the US for inward investment, and that's basically on the back of the rule of law, skills and capital base here in the UK. None of those things are different for any other sectors. So what is it that is causing the issue? Because we've got a clear demonstration of a sector where it is not an issue. So what will you change?
Thank you, Ms. Griffiths, for the question. A great question, and again, I think a really nice example of a genuine British success story. As you rightly say, we've created an extraordinary fintech sector. And in a sense, if I can unpick that a little bit, the question is why did that happen in the UK rather than in, let's say, Germany or France or Italy or Spain or Poland or the Czech Republic? And again, look, I take zero credit. It was before my time. But actually, one of the contributory factors to that was the Open Data Initiative. So it was actually the intervention some years ago that suddenly said, actually, let's create the opportunity.
I wouldn't say that was the overarching.
I'm not saying it was the only one, but you asked what is it about different sectors that have not done it? And actually, one of the interesting tools you can have in terms of encouraging competition is actually saying, how do we actually open up data sets? As a good example of where that suddenly meant that innovative startup businesses could, if you like, compete on a much more level playing field with incumbents than might otherwise. And there are many different ways in which incumbents can operate. And have certain advantages. Obviously, they tend to have scale, they have established customer relationships. They also often have data assets. And actually, when you open it up, you create scope for innovation. And again, if I can pivot a little bit to that, because I think that's one of those tools where, and again, it was a CMA initiative to encourage the opening of that data. If you look at an analogous situation on Fuel Finder, again, this is not necessarily about that, but it's actually saying we believe we can both encourage competition and improve benefits for citizens by actually just being transparent about what is the price every day, every minute, at every petrol pump. So that once you open that up. Yeah.
But if we go back to open banking, yes, I think the open banking organisation now would say that they want to be given more access to create that. But in your role as interim CMA chairman, what have you done to make changes that will start to deliver the growth that has been seen in other sectors?
Yeah, so again, I come back to that point where, as I say, I'm absolutely not saying it was the only factor. There's always questions about access to skills, access to capital, but actually clearly one of the factors, I would argue in this case, and what made the successful fintech sector, and certainly those organisations I talked to, was the open banking initiative that made their data available. We've effectively just done exactly the same through our recommendations, through petrol forecourts. And again, that sort of general, question of how do you actually increase transparency is a very powerful lever. And it's very powerful both for businesses, and I'm particularly thinking of innovative startup businesses that can now actually build tools and services on top of those frameworks. That's very powerful. It's also, I think, very powerful for consumers. So again, if you look at some of the consumer protection work we've done in areas like vets or baby formula or the possible investigation we may launch into dentistry, very often some of the questions come back to actually, do I actually have the information to make an informed choice? So that's again an example of where I think we can take inspiration from the success of the fintech sector and just say, how can we actually move that into other sectors across the economy?
Okay, let's move on to how you're going to balance the time. Obviously, the Natural History Museum is one of the most important institutions of its kind in the world. It's one of the most important visitor institutions in the world.
You're very kind, Chair. Thank you for that.
But it feels like a 7-day-a-week job running that place, not a 3-day-a-week running this place, not least because of the fundraising targets that the institution has got in the year or two ahead. How on earth is it possible to both run the Natural History Museum and to be chair of the CMA?
Yeah. No, thank you, Chair. I mean, so I've always, throughout my career, certainly over the last 25 years, sought, if you like, to be effective enough to be able to run a full-time day job in 4.5 days a week and clear up some time to do a non-profit in the past role on the side. So even when I was at Walmart, when I was at Amazon, and had very busy executive roles, I was still able to. I chaired the Science Museum Group, I chaired the British Heart Foundation, I was on the board of the National Gallery. So I've always done that, and it comes back to, I think, a very wise piece of advice I was given many years ago, which is, look, we all have exactly the same 168 hours in a week, and the piece of advice I was given many years ago is to say, look, not a bad split is a third. You need about a third of that on sleep, you need about a third of that on work, and you need a third of that for everything else in the rest of your life. So that gives you 56 hours a week. I'm quite sort of picky about maintaining very careful diary analysis, and so if I look back over the past 12 months, I've been committing 40 hours a week to the Natural History Museum, 15 hours a week to the CMA. That more or less keeps us in balance, and that's what I've done probably for the last 20 odd years, Right now it's a full-time day job at 40, 15 to 16 hours a week on a second major commitment, which effectively allows you to chair an organisation. As I say, that's been where I've been over the past 12 months, and I say you should, as ever, judge me on the track record, but the Board of Trustees at the Museum and the two departments are very comfortable that these two things should be manageable.
Often these roles are advertised and paid at 2 days a week, but consume twice as much time, especially at moments of emergency. I mean, how, if there is an emergency at the CMA and it looks like an organisation that needs a heck of a lot of work, what happens when you have these surges of work? How on earth can you accommodate that while running the Natural History Museum at the same time?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and like, as we all know, and I'm sure we've all experienced, there are always moments when you have to go all in. I mean, in some ways it's not been the quietest last 12 months at the CMA. There's been, as we met, I think 10 or 11 months ago, as you know, there was a lot of changing going on, and I was also obviously very new to the organisation, going up a steep learning curve. As I say, the reality of that is, on a week-to-week, day-to-day basis, things come and go. But as I say, over the course, and certainly my experience for the last 12 months, is those two things have been very manageable, and I see no reason why it would change going forward. I expect to see, of course, peaks and troughs and moments when you have to sort of, roll your sleeves up and get all in, and if needs be, that's what I'll do, as I say. But I say that off the back of, as I say, 20, 25 years ago of experience of operating like this. I mean, candidly, the last 12 months has been very busy. It's not actually been the busiest period I've ever had. If you want to go really extreme busy periods, there was a period during COVID when everything was crazy. So it's not the hardest I've worked, but I think I'm very, very clear that, I've made commitments to the museum and I've made commitments to the CMA that, if extra time has to be put in, extra time will be put in, and from time to time it does.
What will come first? If there is an emergency at the Natural History Museum and an emergency at the CMA, how will you decide which to prioritise?
Look, you manage both, and you manage both through. I mean, it's a very interesting sort of point. I mean, it's. Again, many years ago, I was given a very wise piece of advice by a mentor. He said to me, look, in this case I was working for a very large organisation and I was getting quite sort of caught up in these kind of issues. He said, look, we're a very large organisation. Crises happen all the time. It's just the nature of the beast. And, think about the following thing. Put yourself 12 months in the future looking back. What are you going to remember? Nobody quite remembers what happened or how it happened, because crises always get solved. They do. That's a moment when people roll their sleeves up, they get stuck in, they rise to the occasion. And 12 months gone from now, the crisis will have been solved, it will be past. Well, nobody will quite remember even what it was or what it happened. What they will remember is how did you behave? And in that moment, were you somebody who could continue to balance the various conflicting objectives, stay calm, manage it, and make it work? And again, I'll refer you back to there have been periods in my career where I've been dealing with multiple crises on a daily basis in different organisations, and you juggle, you rely very hard on brilliant teams, and you intervene. So again, I don't want to be too sanguine about this, but I do come to you with the experience of having, for whatever it's worth, gone through a lot of crises at a lot of times.
Charlie Maynard.
I've got to start by declaring a register of interest. I used to work in them, and I founded a business in '96. I still own a stake in it. I have no role or responsibility in it. It's called BDA Partners. It's in my register of interests. Doug, you've got a very impressive resume, so many congratulations on everything you've achieved. 9 years of that, you were country manager for Amazon from 2011 to 2020. There were quite a lot of tussles with the CMA during that period, and with the CMA's predecessor as well, and quite a lot of tussles since you stepped down, probably referring to that period still. Could you just kind of talk us through, and I'm not going to perfectly hold you, but the ones you immediately remember of what those tussles were and what your take is on them, but just summaries, please. But if you could just kind of walk us through them.
No, thank you. So to be precise, I was at Amazon from 2011 to 2020. I spent a couple of years in the UK as a sort of de facto number 2. I was in China 14 to 16, and then back as UK country manager from 2016 to 2020. I think over that period, obviously like every large organisation, we had many meetings with many regulatory bodies. and I've had meetings with regulatory bodies, obviously not just in the UK, but also in China, across Europe, across the US. I think probably the only sort of specific interaction with the CMA, the only time I came seriously in contact with the CMA at that period was probably in the context of the Amazon Deliveroo sort of interaction, where obviously there was a minority stake that was called in by the CMA. So that was probably my lived experience of interactions with the CMA.
Okay, but what about Amazon UK's during that time? Do you want to add anything else there?
I mean, look, it's, as I say, like anybody running any large organisation, we had very frequent meetings with all sorts of regulatory bodies and all sorts of issues. And there's, as I say, nothing that particularly springs to mind. Okay,
well, let me kind of jog memories. So in 2012, 2013, Office of Fair Trading, the CMA's predecessor, investigated Amazon for suspected anti-competitive practices related to price parity. 2022, investigation of Amazon Marketplace. Fake reviews investigation undertaken 21 to 25, that took 4 years. Amazon Anthropic partnership, they're pretty minor, that one. Probably grocery retailer designation, pretty minor, that one. Then there's the cloud market competition report, which is going on right now in 2025. I mean, that's a lot. City AM says Gurr led Amazon in its tussle with the CMA over its investment in Deliveroo. There's a fairly strong picture there of Amazon repeatedly having to have the CMA come after it because of anti-competitive practices. And what strikes me and others on this committee is that there's a positive interpretation that you're now a poacher turned gamekeeper, but fundamentally Amazon as an entity spent a lot of time batting off or maybe discussing with the CMA, and now we've got somebody who was essentially fighting that off, now in charge of the CMA, and that doesn't sit very well. Do you want to just kind of...
No, look, I think that's a very, very reasonable and fair challenge, and I think, again, if you look at the criteria for this role, which was seeking somebody with big business experience, particularly digital markets, particularly international, I suspect any candidate that you had in front of you here would, to some extent, have been involved in a business that to some extent would have had interactions with regulators. But I think, that's it. It's a very fair challenge. Let me say two things in this context. First of all, and having now spent some 12 months, interacting directly with the organisation, the CMA has incredibly rigorous and tight processes around potential real and perceived conflicts of interest. Very, very tight conflicts around all this that apply, obviously, not just to the chair, but to every member of the board, to every executive working there. And those are very, very rigorous processes, those that in any situation we look at, and obviously in the chair role, you're not necessarily involved in specific decisions or in specific cases, but in any situation, it's absolutely tight and rigorous that you deal with and address any potential conflict of interest. And again, fully understanding the conflicts of interest are both real and perceived. These are equally important. So that's the point I would make there in terms of that. And the second thing I would say, look, it's an absolutely fair question. I would say, look, judge me on the track record. I've been there for 12 months. We've continued to act with pace. Very soon after I joined, we did progress on the digital markets regime with the 3 investigations we've done. Obviously Google on search and search advertising, Google and Apple on mobile operating systems. Before the end of, we've said publicly, by the end of March, coming to the board will be decisions about where the next one might be. And obviously we've got the cloud market investigation. We've been very clear that that's something the board will consider in the next few months. So again, I think I'd say, look, judge me on the track record. Very happy to be queried on that. But again, and again, be reassured that I can guarantee the CMA has incredibly rigorous processes and mechanisms in place to prevent any conflicts.
Yeah. I mean, thank you. Very fair answer. And, we've got strategic market status possibly coming down the pipe for Amazon with cloud services. But, there's digital advertising out there. There's online marketplace and e-commerce out there as well as other possibilities. I mean, as widely reported, and as our chair just mentioned, not a single veto of a merger last year. So that's one point on the track record. Wide reporting in the press about the political pressure on the CMA by the government encouraging a light touch, maybe no touch approach is what people have been saying. Then you've got people like Linklater, Slaughter and May and Ashurst, very reputable law firms, questioning the proposed abolition of the independent panel. So essentially opening the way for the government to have more influence on that. And, frankly, as per conversations we've had with Sarah Cardell, pretty slow kind of to look at initial market studies on people like Ticketmaster, who've got very strong market shares, very little done there. And yes, there was a legal case, I get that, but there are opportunities there. That, as a track record, and DMCC Act hasn't exactly been jumping out of the gate, that doesn't fill us with huge comfort.
Yeah, so let me address a couple of those points. First of all, on the issue no mergers block, to be very clear, the vast majority of mergers, and there are many thousands of mergers every year, do not cause problems. We blocked one merger in 2024. We did not block any in 2025. We blocked one so far in 2026. Obviously, just last month we blocked a merger. We had 4 cases that went through to phase 2. 1 was blocked, 1 was cleared with remedies, 2 were cleared. That's not massively out of line, and you shouldn't necessarily expect to see this. And our position has been very, very clear. The vast majority of mergers do not cause concerns, and where mergers can be cleared, either unconditionally or with appropriate remedies, they should be. So again, I wouldn't necessarily read into this. And it's very easy to say, golly, you went from 1 to 0 back to 1 again. I mean, these are very small numbers, so you should expect a degree of variance in that. I think on the track record point, I would push back on that a little bit. And let me just start, and we can talk absolutely about the digital markets regime, which actually, by the way, I think is an example of a really important win for the UK. And we'd love to come back to that if I have a moment later on. But if you just look at the issue of consumer, over the last 12 months, we've dealt with baby formula. We've dealt with vets. We're dealing with Ticketmaster, notwithstanding perhaps we could have moved faster on that. We've looked at fuel. We've made interactions. We're considering launching investigations into dentistry. At the same time, I know there was questions about and I do think genuinely, and again, very interested in the committee's view on this, but that my experience around this is actually if there's an area where I would want to see more energy interaction, it's around the consumer protection. Because, it's in some ways it's very easy to listen to what business is saying to you. Businesses are organised, they have representative bodies, they come to you. It's sometimes harder to make sure you've actually got the consumer voice in the room. And actually one of the reasons I always enjoy meeting elected representatives, because you talk to your constituents and you bring really passionate and powerful anecdotes around that. And that's a really important part of this. So for me, where you need to lean is the consumer protection. Now, and I do think it's been a challenge in the past that the powers were not as strong as perhaps they needed to be. Now, we obviously got new powers that came into force in March. There was a reasonable level of questioning them, back in the summer about why haven't you done anything. Now, the reality is it takes a certain amount of time because we could only start gathering evidence from the news powers coming in. But as you saw, we went out in November. And crucially for me, we went out to try and work out how do we get the maximum possible impact of our work. We're a cross-economy regulator. So rather than just going after one individual case or one individual business, we said, look, here are some things we've identified as problem. Drip pricing, unreasonable countdown timers. We know these are big issues, and we know these are big issues in many sectors across many businesses. So that's why when you saw we came out across 14 different sectors of the economy. We sent over 100 advisory letters, and we took enforcement actions against 8 people. And in parallel with that, we issued guidance to the businesses doing good jobs. Because if you can do that effectively, you can deal with the issue of drip pricing, not just in the case of one business or one instance, but across the whole economy. So actually, I think that's an example where actually, I have to say, and I've been involved with and led many organisations, I think you've got to give the organisation and the team who work there a lot of credit for actually having worked hard and moved quite fast. And again, we could talk more about, that's just on the consumer side, I'd like to start there, but very happy to talk about the digital markets or the mergers activity.
Anything further, Mr. Bain? No? Mr. Reynolds.
Thank you, Chair. Very quickly, Charlie was asking you about your former employers, Amazon. How much contact do you still have with Amazon?
Yeah, so look, I haven't worked for Amazon for over 5 years. I have absolutely no financial interaction. When I did have a shareholding, I sold down all of my shareholdings, slightly painfully, I have to say, but at the point when I took on the interim role, because I fully understand the importance of being absolutely clear about potential, both real and perceived conflict. So I have no formal connection whatsoever. I still know a number of people, and people occasionally approach me, quite often people who are leaving and looking for a bit of coaching or career counselling, but that's the limit of the interactions.
Do you think your former colleagues at Amazon, when they heard the announcement that you were going to be made the interim chair and the announcement yesterday for your proposal to be permanent chair, were jumping for joy?
You would have to ask them about that. I don't know. I mean,
you know them better than I do.
Yeah, I've not had any conversations with any of them around this instance. I mean, I think what I would say, in fairness, not specifically about my former employer or employers. I've had a number of employers, but generally, I would say one of the things when I took on the role, and again, we've not talked about it, but part of a regulator regime, as well as giving confidence in the stability, you've got to give. It's sometimes as important not as much what you do, but how you do it. And a lot of the feedback we were getting about the CMA specifically was around, you're too slow, we're not quite sure what the process, etc. That's why I was so supportive of the programme of 4Ps Sarah put in. And the feedback I've had generally from businesses, thank you for engaging, thank you for listening to us. So we set up a Growth Investment Council to engage with business. We've got a parallel council to make sure we engage with consumers, organisations and Which and Consumer Association. I'm very pleased to see that the committee here also has many meetings with those organisations. So I would say generally, the feedback generally has been, actually we do want a regulator that's willing to engage and talk to us, which, obviously within the constraints of, we have to maintain an independent decision-making power, and we have very strong powers, but that's probably the biggest piece of feedback.
On the other side of that, your predecessor warned against the CMA becoming vulnerable to short-term expediency or vested interests at the point of his departure. Given that the CMA had quite public pressure from the government to align with its growth agenda, what do you think your appointment in the role says about that?
Yeah.
His quote.
Yeah, and that's, thank you for that question. And if I may, Chad, I'd like to also touch on one of the points you made in your framing around this question of independence, because I think sometimes it's presented as a very binary. You're either independent or you're not. And I think it may, if I could just unpick that a little bit. If you look at individual decisions, should we approve or disapprove a merger? Should we designate an organisation as having strategic market status? Broadly speaking, around the world, there are 3 different ways you can take these decisions. You can do it through the courts, you can do it through political decision-making, or you can do it through technocratic independent organisations. And I think the general consensus globally is that the best way of taking individual decisions is through that independent, organisations, as technocratic as possible. That's what gives you the most confidence in the stability of the regime and also enables the fastest possible decision-making. So that's why when we talk about independence, I do believe and would passionately defend the importance of individual decisions being made individually based on their merits and not based on any other organisation. Now, that said, and I really don't have to tell the committee this, we live in a parliamentary democracy. Actually, the statutory regime, is such that the government is required and does and should issue a strategic steer to an organisation like the CMA. And that, if you like, is a strategic steer set out every 5 years that sort of gives you the framework within which you should make your decision making. So the strategic steer, if you like, says of the various different considerations, and we talked a little about this, how do you weight consumer protection, growth, etc., what is the appropriate weighting? And that's the right thing, and that's what the government is required to do. And then the CMA, or an organisation like the CMA, should be accountable for independent individual decision making, but in the context of that strategic steer. That should define the framework which is used to make the decisions. For me, that's an example of, things working exactly as they should. You wouldn't want to be in a situation, and I don't think when I listen to businesses or consumer groups, they would want to be in a situation where decisions were made with no accountability back to government or parliament. That cannot be right. And so the mechanism of accountability is through the strategic chair and through the challenge of the Select Committee and other parliamentary scrutiny. That's it working well. But within that framework and context, you want individual decisions to be taken within that framework by an independent group of experts, which is broadly what we have. And that's the way in which I would passionately defend the independence of the organisation.
So to take you back slightly to the quote of your predecessor, he warned about it being vulnerable to short-term expediency or vested interests. What did he mean by that when he said it?
I can't speak for what Marcus or any other commentator would have said. What I can tell you is that my experience is that actually, shortly after I took on the interim role, I was very pleased to see that we had a clear strategic steer from the government, because that's actually, in some ways, I think I could argue that had been missing in the past. And therefore, if you like, and that's both not right, and it's also not really fair on the organisation, because in the absence of any strategic steer, the risk is you have to almost create your own, which isn't really where we should be. That's not accountable through Parliament, it's not accountable through government. I think with that very clear strategic steer, and I think when you then look to see the strategy we subsequently published and the forward plan we published, subject to consultation, those I hope you'll see very clearly reflect the strategic steer, but at the same time they absolutely preserve the independence of decision making. And I have to say, my experience over the last 12 months has been there has been absolutely no interference of any way kind on individual decisions. What we've had is a good debate and a good, clear strategic steer. We have the steer that defines the framework. That's the way in which we're now trying to operationalise the decisions. Briefly.
Yeah, just on that point about passionately defending independence, we've got, a consultation is out at the moment, I understand, to take down the independent panel. And that doesn't sit well in terms of passionately defending independence.
Yeah. So again, if we wind back a bit to the current system, so currently for mergers and markets, because we actually have two systems, we have a mergers and markets system, and we have a separate system under the digital markets regime that came into force fairly recently, and they're slightly different, and I'll come back to those. But under the mergers and markets regime, decisions have been... There are two aspects of this which are unusual in international terms and cause quite a lot of confusion. One is this two-stage process, which was not a bottom-up design. That's effectively a consequence of the merger many years ago, the Competition Commission and the Mergers and Markets Authority, and you effectively bolted two processes on the end. And then we have independent panel, and a panel drawn from both executives and a panel pool of independent experts to decide individual cases. Now, many strengths of that system. It absolutely gives you that independent decision making. It gives you access to an extraordinarily talented group of panel members, extraordinarily talented, and I don't expect to see that changing anytime soon. And again, what the department is consulting on, and again I should stress this is the department's consultation, is basically saying, look, enormous strengths of that system, but I think there are a number of challenges, which, as I understand it, is the root of the consultation. One, as I say, is it's very unusual. In fact, it's unprecedented internationally. It causes a lot of confusion. People can't quite understand why we have this two-phase system and these changing things. Secondly, and I actually do think this is quite a key point, and it goes back to my earlier point, is I think it has weaknesses in the accountability. So in the current regime, you quite rightly, as a committee, want to hold and do hold and should hold the organisation to account through its board, through its chair, through its executive. And yet there is no line that flows from your scrutiny or the strategic steer through to those individual decision-making panels. Literally no line. I am legally not permitted to have any involvement in those decisions. So if you like, there's a broken link of accountability there. And that's all this is trying to address. And it's saying, with this, in the context of strategic steer, how do we ensure that the individual panel making decisions take into account that decision-making framework? They will still continue to be, as again, this is subject to consultation. Obviously, as I say, it's a DBT consultation. The CMA will respond. It's been discussed quite extensively with the board. But broadly speaking, I think we are aligned around saying we think it is a challenge, that this is a system that we find very difficult and businesses find very difficult to understand, particularly global businesses. We do think that lack of accountability through to government and parliament is a challenge, and that would be fixed. And also the other thing I would flag is one of the consequences of that two-phase system is it's quite slow. And one of the biggest criticisms we get, certainly relative to international peers, is your decisions. You might make brilliant decisions, but if you make them slowly, everyday costs every day makes the UK less attractive as an environment, so we have to speed up that pace. And then just finally, if I may, again, look, and I stress this is a DBT Department of Business and Trade consultation, or CMA consultation, although we will respond to it. Broadly speaking, what you're looking at in terms of the proposals that I think DBT is consulting on is effectively the model that we've been operating very effectively within the digital markets regime. So you will still have individual decisions taken by individual experts We will still have the need of those same individuals on the panel. We'll still have the need of all of those things. We'll still have independent decision making. But the crucial distance is subtle, but crucial distance is they won't be taken in isolation of that framework through the strategic steer, and it will put back in place, it will put in place what you have in the digital markets regime and you actually don't have in the mergers and markets regime, which is a clear accountability through the board and executive back to government and back to Parliament. So our view, and the board's view, is that this is actually a good consultation. Now, I'm sure there'll be many, many different views expressed and many, many different responses to the consultation, and I'm sure the department ultimately will take its decisions. But that's the board's view.
Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. Just to that consultation, given that the CMA staff wrote part of it, is that sufficiently independent? And with the benefit of hindsight, how would you have made it more independent and enabled us to get to a scenario where we do have the correct oversight?
Yeah. So to be very clear, this is not. This is a DBT consultation. Obviously, as you can imagine, the DBT talked to the CMA in advance of its consultation, but it was not written by CMA staff. It was written by the department. It's the department's consultation. The CMA is one of those people who are being consulted, and we will formally respond to that consultation with our view on what the views are. But this is not something that's come in. It's the department's, as I say, consultation exercise, department's drafting, all of those sort of things, just to be clear on that point. But what I will say is, and as we said at the time, we actually welcome the fact that the department is consulting on this. And we welcome it because, back to those three, again, look, I don't want to, the panel system in many ways has served us well, and the influence is very strong, but it does have those weaknesses. Very hard to explain, very confusing for businesses, weak accountability to government and Parliament, and slow. And if we can improve those things without in any way diminishing the criticality of objective, fact-making, independent decisions, but within the context of that framework, I think, and I know the board agrees, that would be a good outcome. But we will see. It'll be up to the department to make its decisions when it sees the consultation response.
If Amazon or any part of Amazon is considered for strategic market status designation, will you recuse yourself from that decision or oversight of that decision?
We will take it on a case-by-case basis. I mean, as I say,
is that a no?
I think we will take it on a case-by-case basis. I can't answer on that. That's always the way we look at these. At the moment, every single piece of advice I've had that there would be no reason to recuse. But let me also come back to an important point here, which is if you look at the way that regime is structured, what we do is we create a subcommittee, effectively a digital market subcommittee, that looks at each individual cases. That is, by statute, majority non-exec. I do not sit on any of those. I have not sat on any of those groups. I chair the overall board that provides the steer, and those individual decision-making groups are required to take into account the steer that the board gives them. Now, that may change in the past. There's nothing currently that says I couldn't. In practice, we would see on a case-by-case basis.
You'll understand why we're concerned by that.
No, I fully appreciate the concern, as I say, fully understand the reasons, and I think, Mr. Maynard was very clear on that, and for good reasons. And therefore, I think, I would look at it on a case-by-case basis, as I say. And again, I'm acutely conscious that when we look at potential conflicts, it's both the reality and the perception. I could imagine, and again, I don't want to speculate on, it depends a bit on the cases, but I could certainly imagine a situation where if the perception was a problem, then of course it would be better to step back from that. And if that was the case, of course...
I think I can tell you now the perception would be a problem.
That's very helpful feedback. Thank you, Chair.
And so would you recuse yourself from that decision?
I would, as I say, if we would look specific in a case by case, it would depend very much remember the SMS designations are about a particular organisation in the context of a particular digital activity. We would have to look at that. But I hear loud and clear the feedback, and I think it would be challenging, I think, in that situation for me to sit on one of those subcommittees. I'll leave it at that.
How would you characterise your relationship with Mr. Bezos today?
I have not, as I say, I have no, as I mentioned before, I've more than 5 years out of the organisation. I haven't had a conversation with Mr. Bezos for that time, and, I have no financial links. So I would say I'm a distant ex-employee. How about that?
Antonia Vance.
Thank you very much, Chair. Very briefly, if I may, you've worked for two noted
anti-union companies in your time, Amazon and Walmart. Would you say you bring that anti-trade union attitude to this role?
No, I wouldn't. And I've worked with more organisations with unions than organisations without unions over my time. I have to say I've always personally had a really good experience with unions. You know, I work with several unions now in the Natural History Museum. It's a very good, open, constructive conversation. I think unions do a genuinely fantastic job. I think they're a really important part of our operation here. Different marketplaces around the world have different sort of relationships. Personally, as I say, my experience has always been positive, and I would hope to continue to be positive. So no, I would absolutely not do that.
Thank you.
Ms. Young.
Thank you, Chair. On the topic of balancing regulation and growth, you've described that a big barrier to business investment in the UK is lack of predictability of the regulatory environment. Given, as my colleagues have mentioned, the drop in the last year, not just of overall decisions on mergers, but also the number of investigations proceeding through the stages, do you think that you are at risk of conflating stable and predictable regulation with less enforcement of regulation?
Thank you. I mean, a really good question. I mean, the short answer is no. I mean, to some extent, our mergers work is very much demand driven, if you like. We're not in control of that. It's up to what's going on in the global markets, how much activity is which these come in. I think our expectation in our forward planning is that we're going to begin to see an increase in the number of cases coming forward this year. And that's primarily because we simply think there is an increase in the level of M&A activity globally, and therefore inevitably there's likely to be a flow through to more of that. So I think our expectation is the workload's going to increase there, and we'll look at it. So no, I don't think there's anything in that that's things. Yeah.
On a broader philosophical or economic principles level, do you think that there is too much competition and market regulation that stifles growth in the UK right now?
It's a good question. So first of all, we absolutely passionately believe that competition is good for business growth. You know, competition is, and you know, we see that again. That as my day job, if you like, at the Natural History Museum, we kind of believe in competition in evolutionary terms. We believe in competition in sporting terms. We absolutely believe in competition in business terms. So it's a good thing to have, and it always helps. It's not always comfortable, you know, but it's a good thing to have. So we will always strive to actually encourage the maximum level of competition. I do think genuinely there is. You know, we should always challenge ourselves. Can we do more? Can we move faster? I think on the specific sort of mergers activity, as I say, that to some extent is led by what's happening out in the marketplace, how much activity. But I think where there is scope to do more, and I think where there is scope to make a more significant contribution to economic growth and household prosperity is to some extent in the markets work. I think we feel we can do more there and we can move faster. And some of that is about we've not talked particularly about the organisational transformation work the CMA has been doing, but some of that is about the ability to, if I may be a bit more fleet of foot, perhaps being a bit sharper, perhaps moving faster to conclusions, not necessarily having to take so long, because I think that's a challenge. Yeah, and again, it's looking at some of those, what are those cross-economy barriers? And so you'll have seen we've been doing a lot of work on that question of how do we go from start-up to scale-up? And that's often that seems to be where the blocker is. So actually, if you look at our start-up economy, it's really good. Yeah. But actually, businesses struggle to get to that next stage. And again, very often that next stage can be facilitated by something like, well, you know what, I just got that contract to start selling into the NHS or to selling into public transport. So that's why if you look at some of our competitor economies around the world, they're perhaps more savvy than we are about saying how do we give a bit of support to a scaling business. And one of the ways we can support it is through, I think that's where the government has some levers. And obviously that's why we said one of the 5 priorities of our plan this year is to make sure that beyond the mergers work we do, beyond the stuff directly on control, we do lean into helping to provide advice to government where we think there are things that could make the economy move faster.
To go back to your original point of what you're trying to maximise, you stated that you want to maximise business investment subject to not eroding the current level of consumer protection or competitiveness. Does that suggest that you think where the UK is right now in terms of our level of consumer protection and competitiveness, that's the right fixed point, and what we need to do is maximise this other part of the equation?
Great question, thank you. Look, no, I think we need to do more. I mean, you've seen the same data I have. Yeah. There is a significant level of consumer detriment in the UK. We know that. and that's not great. And again, if you look at our, again, I hate to refer back to it, but if I go back to our strategy, that's why we said it's about using the tools of competition and consumer protection to drive both economic growth and household prosperity. So to give you an example, actually, if I may, Mr. Maynard, I'll go back to fake reviews, because actually I think this is a really good example of where you sometimes need a regulator to make an intervention. Now, we know for sure that reviews are highly valued by consumers in making their purchase decisions. And again, I speak for the organisation that I worked for a while that kind of invented the concept of reviews. We know they make a difference. We also know that because they're so effective, there has been this very large challenging problem of fake reviews or misleading reviews and all of that. And that's a global issue across all of these things. And I think what's interesting about that is, I'm sure that was known by many of the organisations, but it sort of took a regulatory intervention to say, actually, because individual organisations, for good and sound reasons, obviously don't talk to each other. They're all worried about, well, I don't want to act unilaterally unless sometimes does. So you sometimes need the regulator to step in. And if you look at the impact of that step in, it's been really interesting. It's obviously good for consumers because they can buy with more confidence the more they know the true things. Interestingly, we've had really strong and positive feedback from small businesses, in particular the Federation of Small Businesses, saying, if I'm running a small business, it's catastrophic for me if I start to get negative fake reviews or if one of my competitors gets things. So they really encourage it. But actually, interestingly, I actually genuinely think, and again, this is the feedback I've had, that's actually also good for the marketplaces because they do not want to be seen as, they genuinely don't want it, but they needed that nudge to get there. So back to your broader question, are we doing enough on consumer protection? I think we need to do more.
Okay, let me just bring in Sarah Edwards on this, because we want to just drill into this question of the balance with consumer protection.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think we're quite interested in the government have obviously given a useful and helpful prescription that the growth agenda is key and paramount. And therefore regulators, including the CMA, are being encouraged to look at how they refocus. So I know you've got a strategy, but I think what we would like to understand is how do you think the CMA is going to wrestle with the pro-business agenda whilst also dealing with this consumer protection requirement that we know is taking billions out of the economy at the moment?
Oh, well, thank you, Ms. Edmonds. I mean, a great question. And again, it's you do often hear this narrative about, are you trading consumer protection for growth? Are you trading, are you giving up consumer protection for growth? And I think there are cases where you could argue that is the case. I think there are many cases where it's not the case. So I would actually argue that if you, and again, we tried to articulate this in our strategy about these two things interlinked, and we're clear on the strategy. We will use our tools of competition and consumer protection to drive both growth and household prosperity. So if you take that question of household prosperity, how do we put money back in our citizens' pockets? Actually, you can do that through direct consumer protection. Hence, if you address the issues around drip pricing, you address the issues around unfair countdown timers, etc., you put money back in consumers' pockets. And that's a good thing for growth. Because obviously we talked about business investment, obviously we talked about access to markets, but actually one of the other really powerful levers is if consumers have more money and they have more confidence to buy, then obviously they will invest, that will drive business, that will drive growth. So these two things are not necessarily in conflict, but you need to sort of unpick that. So I think there's work we can do directly through our consumer protection in terms of support the growth. And then obviously we try and support household prosperity by growing the economy. So actually, we all know if the economy grows, the tax base increases, and we can use that to either choose to return money to consumers through tax cuts, or we can use it to invest in vital public services. And I don't think I have to tell anybody around the committee how much we need to invest in those two areas. So that's why, again, it's for me, it's a little bit more subtle than just saying how do you trade off the two. It's how do you find those areas in which the right intervention can directly, and this is the most important thing, we do this to benefit citizens directly through the consumer protection work, and if you like, indirectly through the work that actually drives economic growth.
Do you think that sort of the pro-business can be a euphemism, if you like, for deregulation, and do you subscribe to that concept?
Yeah, so again, look, I think it's sometimes difficult because one of the things I've learned slowly and painfully over my career that there's a lot of devil in the detail, And actually, and very often it's back to this point that it's not just what you do, it's how you do it. So we might have a perfectly identical regulatory framework that looks exactly the same, that's in the same legal framework, but there's an enormous difference in terms of the impact on citizens and consumers and businesses, just depending on how you execute it. So if I just take one very simple example of this, the single biggest piece of feedback we get from businesses is about pace. And the reason that matters is because imagine if you've got a transaction, there is a time cost of money, as I don't need to explain to people here, and every day that go by costs. It costs because of advisors' fees, it costs because of delayed transaction, and it really, really causes a problem. So actually one of the most important things we can do to reassure businesses that the UK is a good place to do business is just by making our decisions quicker. And that's why the 4 Ps was brought in. It's why we made public commitments to actually accelerate the pace we're doing. It's why we've committed to publishing, which we will do every year, the data around how fast we make decisions, are we making the goods. And I think that's, and sometimes if you're not careful, you don't fully understand the consequence of this. You can make an enormous difference, not necessarily by deregulating, but just by implementing better. And that's one of the things I'm trying to encourage the organisation. And by the way, I don't think it needs a lot of encouragement. I think Sarah and the team have done a good job on this.
And if I could just pick up on what part of the strategy that you've got, so that's running from this year to 2029, and part of that is around obviously promoting competition, spurring innovation, but it's about levelling the playing field for businesses of all shapes and sizes to innovate and grow. And I just wondered, in your mind, what do you think are maybe the top 3 issues that are affecting, let's call it SMEs at the moment, across the country?
Yeah, no, great question. So, well, I can certainly give you 2. One of which is, and again, I hate to come back to that, but it's that point about public procurement. I meet a lot of organisations that are really interesting, innovative businesses, just starting to scale. And and when I talk to a company that says, look, we were born in the UK, we grew up in the UK, we're actually now we cannot sell in the UK, we can only sell in the US, and they're talking about selling to these things. And by the way, if they could just get that contract with the MOD or that contract with an NHS trust or whatever, that would reassure all their other customers, because they find it very hard. So for me, that actually, how do we open up that public procurement to make it easier for SMEs, innovative startup businesses, things to actually get a foot in the door? And of course we understand that, but as I say, I think it's an unintended consequence. But if you talk to anybody who's gone through this, they'll tell you the reality of somebody is, and by the way, I've experienced this from the other side. I mean, I run an ALB, and we go through procurement, and you look at the list of people you're able to use, and you think, really? And so I think we've created that. That's thing one. Again, referring back to Ms. Griffiths here, I do think there are situations where we can actually open up data assets, and that's a very interesting area where you can begin to then build innovative services on top of that. And that's a great example whereby you don't want those things held only by large incumbents. You want to open these things up. We think that's a big area. So those are 2 examples.
Thank you.
You've talked a lot in those answers about feeling businesses' pain. Just persuade us that you're feeling consumers' pain.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Do you have a sense of how much price rises have gone up for consumers on the basics like butter, milk, bread over the last 5 years?
Yeah, no, look, acutely conscious. I think we all feel that in our daily lives. I think we all see that in our citizens. And look, I've spent the majority of my professional working career dealing with consumer-facing organisations, and we all have different views on those. But the reality is, in those organisations, one of the most important questions you have to ask yourself is, how do you get to the reality of the frontline experience, the frontline consumer experience, the frontline employee experience? And I've always been a great believer in how do you create those mechanisms, because part of the challenge, as we all know, as you go through a career, the longer you go on, the more the risk is you become distanced. People tell you what they think you want to hear, and you've got to find a way of reconnecting. So in my supermarket days, I was out there. I sat on the tills doing backpacking and talking to customers. That's how you get connected. In my delivery days, I went out and dropped parcels and delivered and talked to customers. You do that.
How will you do it now?
In this role, that's what we're doing. That's why we created both a direct consumer council. So we now have an organisation that brings those people in. So in parallel with listening to the world of business, the Growth and Investment Council, we have a consumer council, which includes really, really powerful advocacy groups. It includes includes the Consumer Association, includes Consumer Scotland. It's all 4 nations, that representative. And then I talk to people. Look, I live up in Yorkshire. It's not a particularly affluent area. When I'm out there fell running and chatting to my fellow mates, they tell me what it's like. You've got to stay grounded. And you've got to stay grounded on, as you rightly say, the reality of the lived experience. And look, I don't think I need to tell this committee. One of the reasons, by the way, and I'm sorry if I sound a bit... one of the reasons I took the decision to apply for the permanent role is because I genuinely think this is an opportunity to improve the lives of citizens of the UK.
Okay. Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. Wanted to move on to the criteria and principles that you apply when you're determining on what to intervene. So if you could just start both with overarching principles, but then actually get down to some more specific criteria that you would address.
Great question, and I'll stay on consumer if I may, but very happy to talk about those because I think it's a fair challenge. Look, given my business experience, so if I think about where would we choose to investigate or make an intervention, we sort of have 3 sort of intersecting questions. First of all, and perhaps most important, is does it matter to citizens? Is this a topic on which people are spending, if you like, a large, tickets, vet bills, childcare, dentistry? These are things that matter to citizens. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is do we think there's a problem here? Is there some evidence that suggests the market is not functioning effectively? And there are many things that can cause markets not to function effectively, lack of information, all this, this. And then third, is this an area in which the CMA has a toolkit that can make a difference? And if you look at all of that, that's sort of... So if you like, I think one of the things I observed is that, to say, in our mergers work, it's reactive. I think in something like our consumer protection work and our markets work, we have the opportunity to be proactive. And therefore, we need to go after those areas, as I say, that on the consumer protection side, they matter to customers because it's consumers, they're spending money. We think there may be a problem here that's susceptible to challenge. And crucially, it's something we can do something about, either through the lenses of consumer protection, drip pricing, toolkits, all of these things. And similarly, on the market side, we're sort of saying, right, how do we align in those areas that matter to the UK? So we've worked hard to align behind the Industrial Strategy 8. That's why, as you see, we've launched investigations to civil engineering. Again, we know it's important. It's an important area. We're going to spend a lot of money on this. There is some evidence to suggest, and you may have seen that in our interim findings, that this is not a market that's working as effectively as we can. So that tends to be how we think about it.
And once you've picked an area, what are the criteria that you're then going to apply to determine how to take it forwards?
Yeah. So again, it's again, this is actually if it's market tools, which is often what the tool uses. This is actually one of those areas where it's part of the consultation of the DBT, because at the moment it's quite a rigid approach. You sort of have to make a decision without getting into the technical details. Is it a market investigation, a market study? There are pros and cons of these approaches, but broadly speaking, the spectrum is you have more powers to demand information, all of that, but it takes a lot longer. And once you've started down a track, you cannot pivot from one to another, and that's inflexible. So part of what we're trying to do is, or part of what DBT is consulting on, which I think broadly seems to be welcomed, is a slightly more flexible regime that enables us to actually move faster. Because it may well be you get a certain way in, it's pretty clear what the issues are, you've seen an analogous situation, this is the issue, we can move faster and that sort of stuff. At the moment...
You need the DBT to approve?
So at the moment, the regime is set out in statutory legislation, so it would actually require legislative change to give us that flexibility, and that is a constraint. So there's a certain amount we can do, and a certain amount we are already doing and have done through the 4-piece framework. But really to get to a point where you can actually act at the kind of pace you need to and start to deliver benefit faster, it is going to require that. So that's why, as I say, I think the board was pleased to see that is change that the DBT is consulting on.
Do you feel that you are intervening as much as you need to, or do you plan to do more?
I think you should always challenge yourself to say, how can you do more? And I think if you look at, again, if you look at what we've set out in the plan for this year, of course there's work around each of the verticals, the day job if you like, subsidy advice and Office of the Internal Markets and mergers and markets. But there's also a real commitment to put time and energy into organisational transformation. And that's a continuation of the 4Ps framework, but it's primarily designed to make sure that we can we can deliver more. We think there's more that can be done, there's more that can be done, but we want to be able to, we're of course hugely conscious that we don't want to do more by just throwing even more resource about it. We want to actually do more by holding the resource.
I suppose that's an internal piece, but you sort of said you should always look to do more. And I was asking specifically about interventions. What haven't you intervened in that you think you should have been intervening?
So I wouldn't want to get into the specifics, but what I would say is if you look at the CMA, actually, in some ways, it represents extraordinary value for money in the following sense that, every pound spent on the CMA generates £24 back to the economy. That's a pretty phenomenal return. And that doesn't count, enforcement work that brings in fines. So basically, the whole cost of the CMA this last year was covered by fines money that came in. It's not counted in that. So at one level, you could say there's extraordinary value for money. But I think for me the challenge is, and a challenge we've discussed with the team is, we still know, and I think it's where you started, Chair, in the framing, we still know there is consumer detriment. We now have powers, we want to sort of use those to move faster, but we want to do it in a way that affects across the whole economy. So again, it's not just, we're constantly thinking about what are the big issues that are cross-cutting where we can have the intervention, because trust me, we get an enormous number of requests in all the time to say, will you look at this, will you look at that, we'll look at the other. And that's why I think your question is really well framed, because the question has to be, within the resource we have and the appropriate level of resource, how do we make sure that we use that in such a way to get the maximum possible benefits? And that's why if you look at the work plan we've set out for the coming year, we think we've done a reasonable job of balancing that, but of course we're consulting on that and we're listening very carefully to the consultation coming back, and if that consultation suggests there are areas we're missing or things we'd look at, of course we'll look at that and hopefully course correct before we actually commit to this year's work plan.
Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. You touched on the difficulties that it creates for business when CMA takes a very long time to come to decisions, and I wonder if you can tell me a little bit more about what you plan to do to speed that up. But I wonder also if you could reference specifically the likes of the monoliths, the Amazons and the Googles of this world, because there seems to be a particular problem there. The fake reviews issue, which you talked about, took 4 or 5 years to come to a decision on. To a layman, that would seem quite an extraordinary amount of time. And I know that newspaper publishers, and I should declare an interest in that my wife works for Associated Newspapers, newspaper publishers are very concerned with Google, and they're trying to seek remedies for fair payment as they see it. CMA seems to have kicked that back by at least a year now. That's a very long time. What's the problem with pace with these very big organisations that we face?
So thank you for the question. So there are two parts of it. So say on areas like mergers, we've very clearly laid out faster KPIs, faster turnaround pace. We've already published that, we've consulted on it, and we will report and hold account of that. But perhaps this is a good moment to turn to that question of the digital markets regime, because actually, as you rightly say, there are many situations where, and this is not a UK specific case. A lot of the issues can drag on for years and years and years, and you see this in other jurisdictions. You see it where you go through court systems, you see it elsewhere. Actually, I think one of the, and again, this is before my time and I take no credit, therefore, but actually I do think the new digital markets regime is genuinely a much better approach in the following sense. So if you look at, for example, a question that you rightly flag around the two areas we've looked at, which is search and search advertising, mobile operating systems, we know these are really important areas. We know, for example, that in mobile operating systems, that is the gateway to a lot of app developers. And if you look at the UK app economy, that's 1.5% of GDP. That's 3 times the entire agricultural industry. But you've got this question about these large organisations that may or may not have what we call strategic market status. But actually the regime there is quite interesting because, first of all, it's actually by statute pacey. We open investigations. We've already concluded all 3 investigations. We have made decisions to designate Google on search and search advertising, Google and Apple on mobile operating systems. And I think you touched on this in your framing. The crucial thing, what does that designation mean? That's not in and itself a presumption of harm, but it's a 5-year period that says, right, through a lot of consultation, including with the news industry and many, many interested parties, we've heard what we think the issues are. That then gives us an opportunity to sit down with the parties and effectively say, well, these are the issues we've heard. What can we do as remedies? And we have the opportunities to make what are called pro-competitive interventions to try and bring more competition in. We have the opportunity to make conduct requirements, legally binding to do this, and we have the opportunity to accept voluntary undertakings. And within that toolkit, we can move these fast. So actually, on all of these areas, and we have said lots of issues been identified, we'll work on which ones we do first and so on, but we've already got undertakings on mobile to do stuff. That is unprecedented in terms of the pace. Now, Chair opened by saying these are not legally binding, is that enough? And the answer is actually the beauty of this regime is it's outcomes based. We've defined what we think the areas of concern are. We have a monitoring framework. We will actually monitor those things. We've looked at the voluntary conducts. If they don't work or they're not conducted, we come in with conduct requirements. If that doesn't work, we come in.
How long will it take you to assess that?
So it'll be a constant ongoing thing. And I think in that case, we'll be able to assess very quickly because we've got commitments for when these things will be done. So we'll be able to look very quickly at have you done what you committed to do. But crucially, this is an outcomes-based process. So
what's very quickly in your world?
These things have already been, it's on the individual cases, often the lead time is how long does it take if it's a technical re-gearing. But it's, we're talking about undertakings that have already been taken that I think you'll see landing in certainly months, not years. And this would be the only regime in which you see that pace.
Anything further, Mr. Cooper?
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Antonio Vance.
Thank you very much, Chair. Earlier on in our conversation, you described the DMCCA as a win for the UK. Would you like to expand on those comments?
Well, so I think the reason I think it's a win for the UK is it's a good example of a pragmatic regulatory framework that will do two things for the UK. One is it will enable us to address any potential issues and concerns more quickly, to my point, than you will see elsewhere. And these issues, by the way, that we've identified in these investigations they're not unique to the UK. You'll see the same issues in Brazil, you'll see the same issues in Australia, you'll see it in North America. But we're able to move faster because we have a more flexible regime than the other regimes we've seen. But the second reason I think it's a win for UK is part of the conversation we've had with parties, and part of what has been interesting to observe through this process is actually the parties are saying, you know what, if the UK is a kind of regime where we can have a sensible grown-up conversation, we can understand the issues, we can suggest regimes, that actually encourages us to invest and work in the UK as opposed to go elsewhere. And we've seen evidence of that. And by the way, as an example of that, we made 3 designation appeals. None of them were appealed. 3 designation decisions, none of them were appealed. That's very, very unusual. In most jurisdictions, you would automatically appeal, you would fight it in the courts, it would take ages. Actually, I think what's interesting in the feedback we've had with parties, and you'll see that I think in their public statements, is, of course, I'm not saying everybody will love everything we do, but they understand actually this is an area you can work. So that's why I think it's a win for the UK.
And do you plan to start fully using the powers given to you under the DMCCA anytime soon?
We have fully used those powers. We've launched 3 investigations, we've made 3 designation decisions, we've passed the appeal period, we're now into remedies. That's a full use of the powers, and the board is going to consider by the end of this quarter, what we might do next.
Anything further, Mr. Cooper?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. One of my concerns about not just the CMA but other regulators as well is that they're paper tigers, that on paper you've got tremendous powers, but if you don't use them then they just simply sit there and they don't actually affect behaviour in the marketplace, whatever that may be. And so these undertakings, they're not enforceable in any way, shape or form. How do you escalate, and do you not think you should be a bit more proactive with that? Deploying the big stick of the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I'd fully agree with that characterisation. If I just look at the last 12 months, we levelled £130 million of fines directly back to the Exchequer in cases where we had seen behaviour that contravened the law. That's not a light touch approach. That's a significant impact on organisations. And we're very clear, the rules are the rules. You don't play by the rules, we will come in and enforce. We've done that. That is always available, and it's been acted and acted at pace. On the consumer protection side, as I mentioned, we launched and we issued in November as our first phase. We've launched advisory letters to 100 businesses. We're taking enforcement action against 8 businesses, and we've given guidance. That is not going slack. And this is going to resolve issues across the entire economy because it's 14 different sectors, not just on these things. And under the Digital Markets Act, we've been really, really clear. We've got a number of tools. We can consider voluntary undertakings, but we're very clear that this is not a one and done. You've made the undertakings, you've got to demonstrate to us that you follow through those. If you don't, then we will come in and we will put legally enforceable conduct requirements, or we'll make protocol investigations. So the toolkit is all there. The reason we might choose to take a voluntary undertaking is you can move faster. And if the voluntary undertaking works, that's great. If it doesn't work, we come straight in with the next stage. So I think I don't personally accept the characterisation. I think both across the enforcement area, where I know the team works incredibly hard on this, the consumer protection area, all of those powers are there, all of those powers have been used, and again in the digital regime. And if I may, by the way, I have to say, if I could, with your permission, Chair, put on record, I have to say, in the 12 months I've been there, I have been really, really impressed by the quality and commitment of the staff at the CMA. They're mission driven, they're passionate, they're very dated, they're very expert. They could all go and work somewhere else. They don't because they believe.
Well, on that point, can I just jump on that point very briefly?
Come on and see if they share that opinion in a moment.
Yeah,
but
just that point about they could go elsewhere, because the money that some of these people are being paid, they could obviously make a lot more money elsewhere. Yeah. Is there not a danger that you're kind of seeing a brain drain, that you're being left with a lot of relatively junior people? I don't want to say that in an offensive way, but the relatively junior people facing some big corporations with some big high-powered lawyers?
Yeah. No, look, I think it's... Look, I mean, as anybody who's run a public sector organisation, and I run a public sector organisation, of course you're aware that you're not capable of matching... most of the people who work for you could choose to go somewhere else and make more money. Actually, the data isn't suggesting that's the case. We're not seeing a brain drain, we're not seeing a lot. Now, that's not to say that we would necessarily say to any young person, you should come and work for an organisation forever. But actually, for me, it's and I genuinely do want to put on record a tribute to the commitment of the staff there, because they could have options, and the reason they stay and they work at CMA is they believe in what the CMA does. And it's back to that point, if you want to get up in the morning, look yourself in the mirror and say, actually, I believe I'm generating value. And that for a lot of people is worth a lot.
Okay. You'll accept that there was quite a wide level of surprise that both Google and Apple did not face legally binding conduct requirements. The argument you're presenting today is that you're basically going through a staged process of escalation, and you're starting with, if you like, the more simple measures first. I suppose the reassurance that we want is that as chair, you won't stand in the way of a full escalation in a short period of time, if that is what is required in order to induce better behaviour from these companies.
No, we've been really, really clear with the counterparties, and I think also publicly and with all the consultations, is the point. And if I may, the beauty of this regime is outcome based. If you look at the alternative regimes, you tend to either go through a long legal fight about splits or whatever, or you try and change something and it doesn't work. And we've had long experience, not just in the UK, of elsewhere, of you look at a digital activity and you say, right, we're stopping that bit, and then the problem bubbles up somewhere else. And so the beauty of this is we're actually saying, look, it's not about the specific conduct, it's about the outcome. And the outcomes we've taken, for example, on search and search advertising, on mobile operating systems. One of the biggest pieces of concern we heard in the feedback is about fair ranking, the risk that actually I've got my organisation, I'm on the App Store, I need that for my distribution, but I could get kicked off or whatever, etc. So actually the undertakings we've taken, and the reason we've taken voluntary undertakings is because they are faster, and those voluntary undertakings are all of this fair ranking, all of these sort of things. But if they don't work, and we've been really clear with the parties, we're straight in there with contact requirements, and that's the whole point.
Yeah. Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested in the resources that the CMA has, because obviously there's currently been a voluntary exit scheme over a bit of an issue over some of the finances. But obviously with this focus on making sure that consumers are protected, that there is business growth, that there is this new strategy that's going to go forwards, do you think you're resourced enough? I mean, I think you've got about 1,100 staff at the moment, is that correct?
That's correct,
and how does that feel in terms of tackling these beasts? Because some of them are people like your former employer, who are extremely large companies with extremely complex operations. So how's that going to work to make sure that, you know, our constituents and the British public have got the best that they can out of the CMA?
Look, I think it's a very fair challenge, and I think it's and as I say, you know, you could look at the situation and say, look, every pound you're investing in the CMA gives you £24 back to the economy, and that's before we even touch on the fines, you know, and it's before we touch on these. So you could very easily come back and say, you know what, let's just have 2,000 people, let's do more. But I think we're acutely conscious that, you know, we are in very challenging times. Nobody here is saying we want to come in and ask for more. I think what we've challenged ourselves to do is to say, how can we actually improve the effectiveness? Because what we do know is that we want to do more. We see the demand coming. We see both in terms of more mergers. We see more opportunities around this. But for me, this very much comes back to why I'm really, really pleased to see the organisation committing to organisational transformation. And it's invested very, very heavily in something I think all organisations are facing, which is, you know, both you know, do we need 20 people to do this? Could we get 80% of the result and move faster with 10? There's that level of just practically how can we get better results and all of that, which I think is a good, healthy process for any organisation. But the other area I'm really pleased to see the organisation has invested in is obviously technology. We have a really impressive, capable AI team there that's using all sorts of interesting tools, and by the way, that also helps to some extent with solving that challenge that we talked about earlier about how do you get the citizen's voice, the consumer's voice in the room, because actually in the past it's difficult because there's so many. Sometimes you get it. You know, it was extraordinary when we did our vets market investigation. We had over 50,000 responses to the consultation. People really care about this. But actually, both in terms of that evidence gathering in all sorts of area, bid rigging is something we talked about. We now have very sophisticated tools that can actually really accelerate the pace at which a team can operate. And so I think for me, part of how you square that circle is saying the first call should not be to come back and say, give me more budget, take more taxpayers' money. That's not the first call. The first call should say, how do we actually use those innovative tools to do more?
So in June we heard evidence obviously from the CMA and from Emma and Hayley, and one of the things that they mentioned was that they thought that they could do approximately 3 to 4 market investigations a year. So is that with this new artificial intelligence technology being deployed to help analyse huge amounts of data, or is that prior to that?
I think that's probably, again, I don't want to speak specifically of Emma and Hayley. I suspect what they were giving you, again, we can go back and write to you and confirm this if it's helpful. I suspect what they were giving you was as today, because, you know, we don't want to make a commitment. You know, you never want to overpromise and underdeliver in these areas. But what we are absolutely challenging ourselves to do is, particularly in these areas like investigations, is how can we do more? And that's a combination of a little bit of the, do we have to do it quite as exhaustively, quite as rigorously? There are many opportunities, I think, to do these things faster with a lighter resource model and still get to the consumer or the market benefit we want to see.
Because I think in a 5-year term that would sort of give you not very many, you know.
I think, yeah.
So if that speed of things was going to give a better indicator to the public about where you were focusing and actually see some of the remedies, because you're actually one of the regulators who has a very, very strong powers to be able to make that change. Yeah.
So I think there's 2 parts of that. I mean, first of all, you know, most of my career has been spent thinking about how can we do more, faster, better, etc. And I would very much hope, and I know Sarah and the team very much share that desire to become more effective, if you like, on that. The other bit I think is, and I think, by the way, Emma and Hayley do a fantastic job on this, is really being thoughtful about, you know, how do we make an intervention that has a really big cross-economy benefit? So that's back to my point on, particularly on this area, we don't want to just solve a problem for one sector or one organisation. We want to use that whole suite of a combination of guidance, and we shouldn't underestimate the importance of just giving guidance to the many organisations that want to do the right thing but may not quite be aware. Advisory letters sometimes all the way up to formal enforcement, but do it in such a way that we take, you know, as I say, we've talked about drip pricing, we've talked about, you know, misleading countdown timers. There are other things like that we see across the whole piece, so that's why, again, I wouldn't necessarily come back to numerically how many you do. It's how big are these things, how important, and how much do they cut across the whole economy. That's where we get value.
Okay.
And just one final question, Chair, from me, which is around, I mean, it goes back to the question I asked before, which was when thinking about the pro-business agenda and what's impacting businesses, whether you'd had thoughts on where those potential market investigations might be, and what some of those most prominent areas where we know there is failure.
Yeah.
Whether you can share with us any thoughts on that, because I've got a thought on one of those, but I'd love to hear yours.
I would. So I don't want to get into the specifics of particular areas. What I would say, we would hugely welcome any thoughts you can provide us, because I mean, part of a lot of our intelligence comes from listening. And our intelligence comes from listening, obviously, to members of the committee and others. So any thoughts you've got, please do let me know in any way, shape or form. We'll absolutely look at that. As I say, we talked a little bit in my response to Ms Griffiths about the frameworks we use, but we are completely open to ideas. And that's, by the way, when we put out our annual plan, and we will be clear about this, we do, these are for consultation, because we want to hear feedback on that and make sure we haven't missed anything. The only other thing I might add to that is we are trying to make sure we align around what we're hearing in terms of the industrial strategy aids. So the areas where we think, we think there are opportunities, whether that's in, pharmaceuticals or creative industries or those areas. So I think we probably have a little bit of a sort of focus towards those areas, because we think that's important and we want to align with the broader government agenda there. But my short answer is, love to get your thoughts on that.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed. So just final question from me. There was obviously a pretty unfortunate budgeting error that led to the necessity of a 10% staffing forecast. The last staff survey that we have from the CMA shows that just 27% of your colleagues want to stay working with the CMA for at least the next 3 years. Has that number gone up or down in the very last survey?
I confess I will have to write you to confirm that. I don't know whether that's gone up and down. On the budgeting error, so to be clear, this was before my time.
No, indeed, but obviously I'm concerned about two things.
Yeah.
One, how you're going to assure us that isn't going to happen again, and two, what are you going to do to put the staff morale numbers up a lot?
Thank you. So on the first, as I say, this was prior to my time. Since I've got there, I do know we've made a number of changes. First of all, we brought in a new, and I have to say very capable COO, Daniel, who I think is outstanding, who has changed an enormous amount in terms of the reporting, the grip, all of those sort of things. We've also significantly increased the level of audit through the board, the Audit and Risk Committee, etc., to a point where, and we have been very comfortable over the past 12 months that we've seen no repetition. We get good data, it's much more carefully scrutinised. And again, having sat on an enormous number of Audit and Risk Committees, I'm pretty comfortable now that all of those mechanisms are in place. It's probably also worth saying that on the, and again, it's my understanding of the thing is it was a sort of effectively a hiring ahead of the curve because they underestimated the vacancy rate. So effectively we've just got back to about the right norm level of resource. That's now been stable for a while. In terms of staff morale is good. We will follow up in terms of whether that's got up and down. I haven't looked at that in detail. I would say, having looked at an enormous number of staff surveys, I think this one has, first of all, the numbers that I've seen are not particularly out of line with what I see in many government organisations and public sectors in terms of most of these questions. But I take your point that, at face value, that's a number that we should absolutely look into. And we're obviously tracking it very carefully. That data was, as I understand it, I think that survey was sort of, certainly it was round about the time when this was going on. There was a voluntary redundancy scheme, etc. That's never helpful. I also do think
it would be bad if it's got worse.
It would certainly be something we'd want to look very carefully at, as I say. So we'll follow up on that. We'll see where the next data is, and I will follow up you specifically on that. The other thing I would say is this is a period when the organisation has gone through quite a lot of change, and that is always unsettling. So I think that's something that I know the team are looking very closely at.
Thank you very much indeed for your time today. That's it. You've been open and candid with us. You've given us full answers to everything. We really appreciate that. The committee will now meet in private to consider its report, which we will publish within the next 48 hours. But that concludes this session. Order.